Yeah, okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We are going to be talking a bit about the book and what's in it. We're also really open to talking just more about creating trauma-informed content as well. So we're planning to leave lots of time at the end for your questions. But I thought I'd just start with a little bit of background as to why we're talking about this and why we decided to make a book. Um, and you might have heard me say this before, but people have been talking about trauma and design for a while, but less so when we talk about applying it to content and to words. And this has been an interest of mine for a few years in creating content for people who are going through stress and anxiety and trauma. And what do we need to consider when we're working for people who are in those conditions? Because we know it's harder for them to take in information and to make decisions. And that's our job as content people, is to give people information and to help them do the things they need to do. So it makes sense that we think about this from an accessibility point of view, but also from an ethical point of view, and a safeguarding one, and a research one, and a service design one. And when we consider the wider context of the world around us, from thinking about historical traumas as well. And so hopefully that's what this collection covers, is all those kind of different perspectives and viewpoints. So from this idea of let's make a book about trauma-informed content design, it all just kind of fell into place really quickly. And that's one of the ways that we kind of know that it was the right thing to do. So what we ended up with was the work of 15 authors from around the world who've all worked with people who've experienced or are experiencing trauma. And we started working in kind of May, June last year. And we had very tight deadlines, but everybody pulled it all together. And the book came out at the beginning of December. And our vision for the book is that it's an accessible, understandable, not a textbook, but a collection of really helpful learnings, ideas, and questions to explore. And we wanted this to be for anyone who creates information, because it is about getting information to people when they need it. Um, so if you haven't heard me talk about this before, but we know when people are experiencing stress or anxiety or trauma, that stress hormones are taking over cortisol and adrenaline, and they impact how we learn, how we take in information, how we make decisions. So we are working in conditions where we're basically cognitively impaired. It's harder to do those things that we would normally do. And so how can we take that into account? Um, Very quickly, because this isn't just a promo for the book, but it is on Amazon, and if you want to buy a copy. We also have our website, which Con made, which has a number of resources and chapters that are available for free. And just to explain why it's on Amazon, it was a self-funded project. So we made the choice to put it on Amazon because that platform is accessible around the world, and we could provide the book at a reasonable cost. We know some people don't want to buy on Amazon, but that was the choice we made because we were funding this ourselves. So for now, that's where it's available, but there are free resources as well. And I just wanted to talk you through what is in the book. Now, I'm not going to talk about every chapter because we've got 5 of the authors here, but just to give you a bit of an idea of the people who aren't here and what else is covered. And again, this is not a sales pitch. This is to try and explain the kind of all the things that we've been thinking about when we think about trauma-informed content, because there are so many angles. And annoyingly, since the book came out, thought of about half a dozen more things that we could have pulled in. But we start with a chapter by Jack Swetchler, who's in Australia. She's a trauma-informed researcher and designer, and she convenes Social Design Sydney, which is a design community of practice. And she talks about what trauma actually is and how it affects us physically and emotionally. Michelle, Jane, Con, Steph, and I are all here, so I'll skip over that. But Sarah Pathala wrote an amazing chapter on trauma-informed research for content design. So acknowledging that as content designers, we might not be leading user research, although sometimes we might be, but we will be in the room. We might be designing the questions, thinking about how the sessions run, taking notes. And her chapter covers 6 different trauma-informed practices that you can incorporate into your design research work. Kate Every is head of user-centered design at a technology consultancy, and she began learning about trauma-informed design after working in citizen testing services for the NHS during COVID. And her chapter talks about how you can actually bring some of these principles into your work as you design services. And again, we're content designers, but we often cross over with service design. So it's useful things to be aware of. Steph's here, Jane's here, but Owen's our next one. Hugh's not here, and he's a content designer based in Wales, and he's worked in a number of digital spaces where users have experienced trauma, and where trauma is really at the forefront of those services. And his chapter is kind of an in-depth case study exploring what it means to design trauma-informed content. And then Morgan Cataldo wrote a really interesting and powerful chapter on ethical storytelling. So again, this is something that we might come across a lot in our work, where we might be asked to create case studies or to tell people's stories or share their experiences in our content. How can we do that in a way that is dignified, ethical, and empowering for the people whose stories we're retelling, and not just meeting business needs? So that is a really powerful chapter. And I think that's one that's available on the website for free as well. So you can have a look at that if you're interested, or if you are dealing with case studies in your own work. Mayed wrote an absolutely beautiful chapter. Mayed's a decolonial researcher and designer who is committed to dismantling oppressive systems. And Mayed's chapter is called So You Want to Decolonize Trauma. And they ask us to actively look at and question the ways colonial legacies appear in our lives. And they talk about there being a tendency to define and control trauma without considering the root causes and things like collective experiences and traumas and historical and generational trauma. And then Jenny Winfield works as head of research and impact for a feminist organization. And she's led design research on issues that tend to be hushed up and not talked about. And her chapter is about protecting ourselves when we're doing difficult work. And she makes the case that the work designers do deserves care. And this is something that I often get asked about when we're talking about trauma, is how you take care of yourself. And Jenny's chapter is a really solid explanation with some kind of practical tips of things you can do to take care of your spirit when you're doing this work. And then Miriam is a lead content designer and researcher, and she talks about crisis communications. So again, how you can kind of either build these principles of trauma-informed work into crisis communication, or how you can do the opposite and break all those principles, break trust, disempower people, and not meet their needs. So if you have one of those content jobs that maybe crosses over into internal communications at all, this is a really good chapter. And then finally, we have a chapter by Rachel Deakus, who's the founder of Social Workers Who Design. And recently, she served as the first social worker and trauma-informed subject matter expert at the White House, leading trauma-responsive design and national projects in digital transformation. And her chapter is about how understanding trauma and building what she describes as trauma literacy is essential to a content designer's practice. So that is a whiz through of what the people who aren't here. But now I want to talk about the people who are here and the chapters that they wrote. And so first, I'm going to introduce you to Josh. And Josh is a UX researcher and accessibility designer who's worked in designing for veterans in the US. And Josh's chapter explores why trauma is an accessibility issue, but how common ways of looking at and defining accessibility may not work here. And he also addresses access trauma and how WCAG may not be the answer to improving usability for people who've experienced trauma. So Josh, are you there?
Hello, I'm here.
Hello. So Josh, we tend to look to WCAG for guidance on making accessible content, but your chapter suggests that WCAG is not the answer. So can you explain a bit about why trauma is an accessibility issue?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I'll do my best to simplify it, but my chapter is free online as well if people want to give it a check. we all carry a lot of different identities, and when those identities intersect, they carry unique experiences. Some can experience trauma, low vision, and neurodivergence all at the same time. It's just how we are as human beings. For example, this can kind of work its way into what we're doing if, say, we're designing a form to apply for disability benefits. We can write that in a really well trauma-informed manner, but it's going to be a little meaningless if at the end of the day it hasn't been engineered to be accessible to an array of various assistive technologies and preferences. In fact, on that note of access trauma, a lack of access in and of itself can be a source of trauma. Robert Kinget writes about this, noting a lot of the similarities he's found between PTSD to his own experiences, just being activated by repeated injustices from a largely inaccessible web. Good chunk of the web is inaccessible. It makes me sad. As to why WCAG isn't necessarily the answer, WCAG being the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that giant tough book to kind of read through, I'd say, not very plain language. It's nuance. It's certainly a part of the answer, but it's absolutely not the only solution. I like to see it as just another tool. On the positive side, I see it as a potential starting point. And in the words of Eric Eggert, kind of a guardrail. It gives a very easy target to build metrics from, and can provide what's essentially, that guardrail that prevents your car or an organization from like flying off of a cliff. That being said, a guardrail is a baseline. If I am driving my car, I don't really want to be trying to edge the rail. So more importantly, we can't really design for trauma holistically through WCAG because a lot of its criteria is meant to be objective. The concept of it being objective is a fairly Western and colonized way of approaching work that, again, really fails to acknowledge and address, I think, the more subjective lived human complexities of trauma. In fact, this goes beyond trauma itself. It's a conversation of disability at large. If you've met one person with low vision, you have met one person with low vision. That experience and a person's respective needs may and will range from a fluid array of selections in flux. From my everyday eyewear, for example, to someone using a screen reader when they're experiencing a migraine. All of those use cases are deeply personal and different. So if you're conducting research, don't just like conduct research with one identity group and be like, hey, I've completed it, I'm done. That's not how it works. Need to do a lot more work than that. So to kind of sum up a lot of my thoughts, I would really encourage everyone here to approach the intersection of accessibility and trauma from that subjective, not the objective lens. Touch grass, I'm talking to myself, experience disability, hire disabled people with a range of intersectional identities, promote them, support them to become leaders, and just evolve beyond that crude and limited tool like WCAG. The more we lean towards people and less towards any one method or tool, it's just so much more fun and impactful. Obviously harder in times like these, but we got this.
Oh, thank you, Josh. I feel all inspired, but for I think we as content people, we're used to having WCAG as our like big stick to kind of we can say to our organizations, accessibility matters because WCAG, look at these things. So in the absence of that, like how do we kind of make that case that accessibility and trauma that they go together, that we need to be, if it's hard enough to say we need subtitles and we need transcripts.
Yeah.
How do we bring trauma into that discussion as well?
Yeah, the main risk with relying on WCAG, Lainey Feingold kind of writes about this a lot. If your main argument is based on the letter of the law, when the letter of the law fails you, it's not going to be too great, as we're seeing in the US right now. But beyond that, people can get fixated to just meeting the minimum requirement alone. So kind of approaching it with a stick motivates people to do the bare minimum instead of actually thinking about I think maybe the alternative option I would present at the VA, I see some of my colleagues here, some of the biggest impact that we've had is just increasing the volume or increasing the normalcy of just doing our research and testing with disabled folk first. And as a result of it kind of designing from the edges of the bell curve, there's so much more that you can fill in between. And it's extremely hard, I think, for most people to push back after they see a session where they're like, wow, this is completely inaccessible and it's causing emotional distress for people. It's very hard to push back on that. But again, I think, at least in the context of the US, it will be hard. There will need to be activism and other ways around it beyond our day-to-day tech work in and of itself.
Oh, thanks, Josh. And I think too, one of the things that we've found is that in general, good content design works really well hand in hand with trauma-informed design. Things like short sentences and clear content, that helps. And that helps with accessibility too. So they're not at odds with each other, but keep fighting the good fight, Josh.
Right.
Next, I want to introduce you all to Steph. And Steph has worked in public, private, and third sector organizations as a senior and a lead content designer. And she's done everything from small campaign projects to digital transformations. And she's currently working with the content team at the University of Cambridge. And Steph's chapter is called Working with and for Young People, and it covers work she did as a content designer with a national charity. And she created content there on numerous difficult topics from sexting to suicide, often working with young people to co-create them. And she explains too in her chapter that young people are a wide-ranging and fast-changing group and explores what trauma looks like at different ages. So Steph, are you there?
I am here. Hello.
Hi, Steph. Can you just tell us what some of the differences are when you're writing in a trauma-informed way for young people compared to adults?
So, yes, I can. So, children and young people generally don't have the same coping mechanisms as adults, and they definitely don't have the same experience to help them deal with trauma. So, that in itself just means that we need to adapt our content design approach in order to meet those very specific needs. I think broadly, anything that you have in place for adults will still be absolutely right for young people, but for young people specifically, you really need to look at it on a deeper level. So as you touched on, Rachel, research does show that trauma obviously can cause harmful levels of stress. And when you're kind of growing and your hormones and all these other things are happening, it's got like a bigger impact on you. So that levels of stress can have an impact on a young person's learning, their behaviour and health. And in turn, this can then affect their language development, their ability to pay attention, and their ability to regulate their emotions. So I think that by keeping all of that in mind, you can already start to see that you might need to do some things differently. So when it comes to creating children, sorry, not creating children, creating content for children and young people, age is an incredibly important factor. So children's behaviour changes through the ages and stages depending on what's going on. And they'll have different needs all the way from childhood right through to adulthood. I won't go into much detail about those differences because that is covered in my chapter, but I would really advise anybody writing for different age ranges to kind of thoroughly research this as an area. And talking of research, whether you're doing this on your own as a content designer or you're working with a user researcher, I'd suggest that you learn as much about your audience as you can. If you can really understand their language and concerns from the start, you're already starting to build that trust with them, which is a very, very, very important factor. So if you're working directly with young people to create content, you really need to build that trust, and that starts very early on in that relationship. So you need to invest a little bit more time building that relationship with a young person. So if you're doing pair writing, for example, you need to create a safe space, give them clear boundaries, allow them to lead the conversation if that's what they're comfortable doing. And very importantly, always make sure you're following safeguarding procedures. They're there for a reason for both you and the young person. I think one more thing I can probably suggest is to get more feedback. Get more feedback than you normally would. It's so important that your content is right. So you don't want it to be triggering or activating to your audience. And there are two ways that you can do this. I mean, there's probably lots of ways you can do this, but the two ways that I did on this project was, firstly, if you can, get a professional SME to check your content. So this could be a child psychologist, a social worker, a youth worker, whoever's kind of close to the young people, because any professional who can help with the language will understand if things are wrong in your content and they will tell you. And secondly, after that phase, I would test it with young people, as many as possible, because their feedback might be brutally honest, but equally it will be the most helpful thing that you will ever get on your content.
Oh, Steph, thank you so much. I mean, I I think how hard it is sometimes going into a normal pair writing session with another adult, and then you think trying to get the trust of a child or a young person or a teenager, and then you throw in talking about the kind of topics that you've been working on. And I don't know, I mean, it sounds a little bit scary, but did you enjoy it?
I did enjoy it. Yes, I mean it was quite powerful at points, I think, but it was an incredible experience. And yeah, I mean I think young people are probably the best people I've ever worked with, to be perfectly honest.
Oh, I want to go hug a hoodie or something now. Thank you, Steph. Um, oh, wrong keyboard. There we go. Jane, Jane, are you there?
Hi, I am.
Hello, hi Jane. So Jane wrote a chapter called How Trauma-Informed Principles Can Work in Government. And Jane is a senior content designer who's worked in the public sector for over 20 years. And she's currently the design lead for bereavement and care digital services in the Department for Work and Pensions, which is the largest UK government department. So Jane's chapter looks at how people often come to government content at stressful or difficult times to deal with stressful and difficult things like benefits, illness, or in her case, death. And then she looks at how the gov.uk design systems and good content design practice in general can support working in a trauma-informed way. So Jane, a lot of people think that trauma-informed content has to be very soft and gentle with a lot of padding and soft words around it. How does that work with what we often think of as the voice of government, being very direct and to the point?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. It's something we get asked quite a lot in our area as part of government working in bereavement services. And of course, as content designers, we always want to do the right thing for the users. But there's that inherent second guessing, that worry that the direct tone that we use in government might be a bit cold, not empathetic enough. But actually, our research with bereaved folk has shown that when they're dealing with a bereavement, it's actually a time when people really needed and appreciated clear and direct language. So unfortunately, when you are dealing with a bereavement, people are really busy. They have a load of different tasks they need to do, lots of organizations to deal with, and often they're doing tasks for the very first time. So these people by default were already really stressed, quite anxious, worried, very, very busy. And this was on top of the emotional impact of dealing with a bereavement, grieving perhaps for them as well, and very often supporting other people as well. So actually content that clearly told them what to do and importantly, what they didn't need to do was actually really helpful. And this is really incredibly similar for people in crisis or experiencing other kinds of trauma. Clear and simple communication is really helpful and is best. So we know that people experiencing and go through a bereavement have a complicated mixture of anger, depression, anxiety, frustration, overwhelm, and even in some cases, relief. It's complicated. It's different for everyone. But what these emotions can do is affect a person's capacity to think or do things that ordinarily they would do without even thinking. And they can show up in a person as something like absent-mindedness, confusion, lack of concentration, or just being very preoccupied. Now, what of those things I listed could affect how well somebody can do a task or make a choice, and it can affect their ability to understand something that ordinarily they would just do without thinking. So then it becomes really super important that our content is clear and simple and easy to understand. So what I try to do in my chapter is to give them some practical examples of how you can approach this.
Yeah, your chapter I love because it is very practical, but also you've got such a lovely tone of voice when you write, Jane. I don't know if you know that, but it's like having a chat with somebody. But I think, it is the thing that I find it comes up all the time when you're talking about trauma, and our natural instinct is just to add stuff in, to add words and feelings and try and tell somebody how they might be feeling. And is that something that you think you kind of, are you still making that point in DWP, or do you think people are catching on?
Oh no, I think definitely people have caught on. And the amazing work that Helen does in the co-op in funeral care, and all of the work she's done within the content design community about dealing with the bereavement and how to communicate to people. I think, you know, the platform that she's on, she's inspired me, she's inspired our work. It's brilliant. And what's really powerful for me is that everything that she said and shared in this space, and we've all learned from, is actually completely validated with all of our research with bereaved people. We do this day in, day out to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the people that come to our services at a huge point where they need that help and support. So I think a lot more knowledge is out there than there used to be, for sure. But there's always, I think, that inherent perhaps reluctance that I'm not doing enough, I'm not being empathetic enough. And it's really quite, I think, liberating to understand that at the point when people need it most, simple and clear is actually meeting their needs, is actually helping them. I did mention before, sometimes it's really important not to include actually what they don't have to do, because you can imagine how busy these people are dealing with lots of different things, perhaps at the first time. By telling them they don't have to do something is super helpful, and it's really clear, and it takes that load off them. It reduces what they need to do.
Absolutely. It's that kindness is actually in being clear and direct, and not necessarily in adding stuff in. And actually, I should stop talking about that, because I think, Michelle, you're going to talk about that in a minute. But thank you, Jane. I've just lost my notes. 2 seconds. There we go. Con's there. I'm sure I've seen Con.
Hi, yes, here.
All right, so Con is a software developer who also designs. And for the past few years, he's been exploring the intersection of trauma and technology. And you might have seen Con's work on LinkedIn. He was writing a blog series last year that was just amazing, about all the kind of different design choices that you can make that can make your work more trauma informed. And Con's chapter looks in detail at these choices that we can make, from considering things like color and even fonts, to exit this page elements, and choices we can make to reduce cognitive load. This chapter is really a fascinating exploration of all of this. And I was a little bit nervous going to read it, because I thought, I don't understand this side of design, but it's really accessible and wonderful, and one of my favorites in the book, although I'm not supposed to have favorites. But Con, a lot of the things that you talk about are around the more technical side of websites. So where do you think that content designers can work with software designers to make more trauma-informed systems?
Well, first of all, thank you for this introduction. Wow, thanks. I love this question. And as Josh was speaking, I actually had an idea of like a metaphor of when I'm driving a car, what I need to know is how to drive the car. But then if I go and drive a different car, there will be subtle differences of how much I have to press the pedals, or like how I'm gonna change whatever. And I think that it's something similar here of, yes, how you write content has specific ways of being written, but then depending on where this content lives, there might be different nuances of how it can appear, or of how things can be displayed, be presented, etc. And I think that's a starting point of understanding technology, especially if you're writing content for tech, like an app or a website. It can give this better understanding of where the content will live, and then it can like start creating the conditions of better understanding how you can present it and display it or position it in a more trauma-informed way. And then there are like, of course, small parts of content which I think sometimes might be left to the UI designers or even to the developers, like, what is this button gonna say? How is this error message gonna be communicated? All those things. But having worked with content design, especially for the rest of the book, it's so much better when someone who knows how to write, like even those like small parts of content, comes in and helps, that it makes the whole thing so much better. So kind of like summing up the two, I think one is hopefully content designers can better understand where their content lives and then use its understanding to ask questions and like find ways or have ideas of how it can be presented and can be displayed in a better, more informed way. And number two, there are parts of content which it will be really helpful if they are more trauma informed, especially when we're talking about like errors or warnings. And often UI designers or software engineers will not know how to do it. So if the content designer can come in and give a hand, it's very useful.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason why everyone should read your chapter, because you really do start to think of all the different things that you can influence. That I mean, we tend to think design, exit this page, okay, that's it. But there's so many more things. So it's a really good chapter and well worth having a read. Thank you, Con. I'm just keeping an eye on time because I've been talking too much. Sorry. I'm going to briefly introduce you to this chapter, which is one that Steph, Jane, and I co-wrote because we find that questions are a really important part of a content designer's work, especially if we're doing something like creating forums that ask for information. And the three of us have all worked on services that ask for particularly sensitive information or information at a time of trauma, such as a recent death. And we realized that there are some parallels and unexpected things across our experiences in asking questions. So Jane and Steph, just briefly, what is one thing that surprised you about asking questions to people who have experienced trauma? Steph, do you want to start?
Sure. I think one of the things that surprised me the most was when you're designing the forums and you're gathering that feedback and you're testing, and it was participants' willingness to kind of share their experience and open up. So they didn't just like say that something wasn't working. They would often tell you why it didn't work, or tell you a better way to do it, or how to even phrase a word or a sentence in a different way. So this in turn would help reduce cognitive load, and it really helped give me context and lessons that I could take away with me and learn from and take that forward into my content design now. So
I think that desire to help and to turn their own negative experiences into something better is really strong. I found that too. Jane, what about you?
Yeah, I think the thing that I found really interesting was that even with really clear, super clear content, sometimes people need a little help and support completing questions. And that could take the form of like hint text, for example, or an explanation even of why you're asking that question. So you get past that hesitancy of continuing in a journey, for example. Even giving an example of the thing that you would want the person to enter into a form, for example. And I actually find this really helpful for myself. I have dyscalculia, which is a neurodiversity, and it often means I have difficulty understanding numbers and codes and different things and being able to transpose them accurately. So sometimes they get mixed up when I'm having to enter something into a form or having to recall them correctly. I just can't do it unless I can see it in front of me as well. So giving me a really good example of what I should be putting into a form if I have to enter something or enter a code, and the format it should look like and what it should end up being like is actually really helpful. And I can use that as almost like a mental map to guide me to success, if you like. So those little hint texts, those little supportive questions, content around your questions, it can be really powerful for a lot of people.
I think definitely I found that in my experience too. And the one that surprised me was that if you're asking questions and they felt to this particular group when we tested it, if they felt too similar, the reaction was they felt like they were being questioned. I thought that was really interesting. So we thought we had perfectly good like service needs for asking their name or their date of birth more than once, but they felt like they were being cross-examined, and that was something I really didn't expect. So I had a great time writing that chapter. It was really fun writing it with the two of you. But it does go into depth about what to do and what not to do when you're designing these questions. And I hope it's useful if you've read it. Would love to know your thoughts. And our last author today is Michelle. And Michelle began her career in social work and transitioned to content design, and most recently led the content design practice at a US hospice, supporting families who are grieving. And she's really passionate about designing content that provides hope for people in difficult situations. And her chapter discusses how she created content for families in hospice care and adapted existing trauma-informed frameworks to guide her own work. And through the chapter, she offers questions to guide your own practice as you deal with difficult topics. And Michelle, you mentioned 4 principles that guide the way you design content: trust, agency, welcome, and hope. And why is it particularly important that you design content in a way that promotes hope? And what does that look like in content?
Oh, thanks, Rachel. I think when we talk a lot about trauma-informed content, there is this sense, I think Jane referred to it too, that it's all very heavy and sad. And so I think it's really important when we're designing our content and thinking about how do we organize these words on the page, how do we organize images on the page, that we are with a focus toward helping the humans for which we're designing to flourish, to live lives that are full of the things that bring them joy. And what that is for each person, obviously, I don't know that. But when I'm writing content, can I offer an option that looks holistically at what does human flourishing look like? Can I use the technology to make their lives better? When we were designing for families that were grieving, can we write in such a way and design the content in such a way that folks can see that there is still life after they lose a loved one, that my grief doesn't go away, but my life can encompass it in a way that is healthy and whole. And so I think it's important to have that as an end goal in mind when we write content, that the goal of my content and the tech that I'm working on is not to consume the person's life, but to free them up to live a life that is whole and that is healthy. And so that could be by having images that aren't all sad, by using colors that maybe are muted but not depressingly sad. That because we're talking about big topics doesn't mean that everything has to be somber. That there are ways to interject life into that, whether it's through color or typography or the actual words that we're using, by making our experiences easier to navigate. It gives them back time. If they're able to come on my website and do what they need to do quickly so that they can spend time with their family, then that's hope for them. So thinking long-term beyond just the experience of what I'm designing. And I think it's really important. Jeremy Cherry wrote a book called Designing for Hope. And in it, he talks about that we want to be curious, we want to be compassionate, and we want to be humble. And as designers who say that we're focused on the humans that we serve, I think that's really important, that I want to be curious and understand the people that I'm designing for, and that I want to be compassionate. I want to be moved to help alleviate their suffering in the best way that I can. And then I want to be humble and recognize that I don't have all the answers. And so I want to be able to incorporate them into the process of what I'm doing.
Oh, Michelle, I wish we had more time because there's a million more things I'd like to ask you, but I also want to make sure we've got time for questions from people who aren't me. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to quickly show you this so I can stop sharing my screen and see everyone. But that's our website there, designedwithcare.org. It's got contact details for all the authors. It's got the free chapters on it, and it's got linked bibliographies. So if you go onto there, you can see all the references and you can just click on them and go straight to the articles and things we're talking about. So please do check out the website, and we are all really, really excited about talking about the book and our work. So do get in touch if you've got questions or things that we don't get to in this session. The book is available in Amazon, in paperback, and in Kindle. And that is all I'm going to say, because I want to stop sharing my screen and see everyone and hand it over to you for questions.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. That was super interesting. And I've read the book, but it gave me like some new ways to think about it. And actually, it's really interesting to see some of the echoes across. So I made some notes about Jane and Rachel, you both mentioned about don't include what they don't have to do. And in chapter 14, Miriam writes a really interesting example of crossing a border in a war zone and crisis communication, and how quickly it can go wrong for that exact reason. So yeah, it feels like that was one of the common threads all the way through, which is really interesting. There are a lot of comments in the chat, and there's been some questions that some people have already responded to. Rachel, I know you've literally just been talking for how long. Yeah, I think it's probably worth you having a look through and then having a think about who might be good to kind of move some of these questions to, because you understand obviously people's specialisms better than I do. But I just wanted to call out one that was for all of the panels. So perhaps Rachel, while you're looking through the comments, I'll pose this question and then anyone on the panel can come and answer it. So from David. How do you measure success with trauma-informed strategies you implement? Is it possible to recruit for trauma-informed user testing?
Oh, that's a good one. I'll start us off and then others jump in. You can definitely do user testing with people who've experienced trauma. It requires a lot of planning and a lot of careful thinking about how you're going to support those people. And there are also times when you don't want to do it because it would be too difficult, too re-traumatizing, and you might want to consider using proxy users or subject matter experts. In terms of measuring success, I'm not sure I've got the answer to that, but I think what you need to start with is moving away from the idea that trauma is an edge case. We use a stat in the book that over 70% of the world's population has experienced a traumatic event. So we don't want to get into sort of discussions with stakeholders that making this change is only going to affect a small number of people. It could affect a large number of people. So I think that is, I don't know the answer to how we do it, how we measure, but I think that is how you want to shift the conversation, that trauma is not an edge case. Does anybody else want to jump in on that? We can come back to it too if you want to think more. I'm still scrolling.
I was just going to add, yeah, 100% agree, Rachel. I think what we're trying to do in our particular services is understand the journeys within our digital services that are successful in as much as they work well for everyone, they work well, they don't become a barrier. And it's the success of the service that we know with the people that are our users that are particularly going through difficult times, to make sure that we support them to be successful in that service, to get through the questions, to get to the end point, and equally to enable people that perhaps are not going to have the outcome of eligibility to be notified as soon as possible within the survey. So a bit like our questions that we talked about in our chapter, Rachel, where also supporting people to be informed of what they need to do next, because this isn't the journey for them, they need to go elsewhere, and to signpost that so that we're continuing on their journey and supporting them to do that. And yeah, it's tricky, but I guess really it's that question over who is traumatized, who isn't. And that's a really hard tell, because we all, as described earlier in the call, we all have some level of trauma caused through lots of complexity. So yeah, it's definitely a tricky one, but it's about, for me anyway, it's about improving our services as much as possible for everyone and making sure that they are iterated on and that they continue to work.
Thank you, Jane. I've just seen one pop up, and I think I'm going to fire this to you, Michelle, because I seem to remember you did some work with branding and sort of marketing. And is that right? Can I send this question your
Yes.
which is, how would you recommend dealing with a senior stakeholder who uses branding as a shield to block changing things, making them more inclusive and accessible?
I actually was typing a response to that because I did deal with that. In my hospice, we had 23 different brands and they all had different colors in their brands. And it was really important to our senior stakeholders that each website maintained that individual branding. But I knew that the colors were not accessible. And so I started off by just saying that, and people were not impressed and they didn't care. And they said, it's really important that each one is branded individually. You have to have them. So I actually talked to Josh about this example, and he directed me to a site called whocanuse.com. And you can plug in colors that you use on your website into there. And then it gives you a whole list of what those colors will look like for people and for people with different conditions. And since a number of our users are older folks, conditions like cataracts, and they actually had old age, I think was one of the options on there too. And it shows you what it looks like and it gives you a score for how accessible it is to people. And every single one of our websites failed on that. And the results were so overwhelming that when I showed it to the folks who had said, we can't change the branding colors, I said, but here's the problem. People can't read our website. And here's the results of the colors, and they simply do not work. And they were shocked, absolutely shocked, and said, we have to find a way to fix that. So I was actually in conversations with our marketing department to talk about, how do we want to do this? Do we want to come up with a new set of colors? Do we want to just take our brand colors and make them darker or clearer? Or how do we want to engage with this to make it work? So I think finding evidence that actually shows that what you're doing is not working was really helpful, not just telling them, hey, it needs to be more accessible, because that wasn't motivational for them. And thanks, Josh, for that site. I've recommended it to a number of people.
Fabulous. I'm wading through, and quite a few questions have been answered by comments, but if the people who asked them want to ask here or want to ask anyone.
Sorry, just to interrupt. It may be worth repeating it because on the recording, so we'll keep the section of the recording for the people who weren't able to come. They won't see the chat, so it may be worth just reiterating some of the main points on the call as well.
Okay, I'm back to scrolling again. It also, feel free to just pop your hand up if you've not asked it in the chat. There's one about, now this has quite a lot of discussion already, but it's about, I think if I can sort of paraphrase, how do you separate real trauma and normal responses to things? And I think that is a kind of really central question to a lot of what we talk about when we're talking about trauma. And I don't know if I've got the answer. I think what I found in my work anyway is that people tend to not associate their experiences with trauma. They tend to think of trauma as for bigger things. And I think when we do use the word trauma, we often use it almost flippantly. Like, we were traumatized by the spider in the bathtub. I've certainly said that before. And so there's this kind of tension between what justifies being a real trauma and what is not. And I find it kind of helpful to think of it as it's the impact of the event and our reaction to it rather than the size of the event itself, because something that happens to you when you're 4 years old might not be traumatic to you as an adult, but could certainly have been as a child. So I know, Josh, you've answered quite a bit about this already, but I don't know if you want to repeat that, or if anybody else wants to come in, or the person who asked the question. I won't make you come on camera and ask it if you don't want to, but is there anything more you wanted to kind of pull out of that one? Because I think it is a really important question.
It is an incredibly important question, also incredibly difficult and subjective and tied up in like many systems. I think Rachel Deakes probably wrote about this in her chapter a little bit, but one more practical way of, I think, at least approaching this type of question is reflexivity in general, just within your team and in terms of people that you're actually interacting with and working with. So folk who are maybe unfamiliar with reflexivity, to put it kind of simply, it's like, what identity groups do I belong to
does my team belong to? And how might that impact how we define, approach, and like kind of view the world in a sense of what is normal, what is not normal, for example, among other things. So just as a starting point, having teams that are more representative of actual diverse populations is a huge thing. When I say diverse, not diverse in like the fluffy capitalist, hey, here's a picture of marketing kind of thing, but being very intentional about who are the most vulnerable, underserved communities who are impacted the most with the least amount of power. How do we shift the control, the authority, and the agency to them? And kind of figure out that justice equation. I think that's so important, especially when it comes to defining what trauma is in the first place, given that it's such a subjective thing, person to person, culture to culture.
Yeah, I think that's the important point to make, subjective. And I think too, my chapter is about content warnings, and one of the challenges around content warnings is how to use them effectively, because the things that will trigger people or activate people are so personal and so varied, and you can't write a content warning that will prevent someone from being re-traumatized. But so I talk quite a bit about how you can deal with that, and is that even the purpose of a content warning? Is it to say, you know, these words happen in this chapter, or is it to say you've got the choice and here's how you can engage with this content safely in a way that works for you, that gives you control and power as the person who's reading it? It looks like we've answered that question. I think the person who asked it has no further comments. So is there anything else? I think we've probably got time for one more if anyone wants to jump out. I've got a question for the panel then, just to bring us home, which is short answers only, but for all of you, what's one thing in the process of working on this book, reading other people's chapters or just going through it, that you didn't know or that surprised you or that you've taken away from this about trauma-informed content? And I'm springing that on you. I'm going to start with Josh because you're smiling.
I'm smiling. I think a lot about like care networks in general now, and how supportive a lot of the authors were contributing to one another, supporting one another throughout the process, where we weren't actually writing in our own silos. We had so many people in each other's docs doing editing, supporting one another, doing that kind of connection that I didn't actually anticipate would happen when Rachel first approached me. So yeah, just a kudos to how that a lot of the things we're learning here has been like directly input into the process that built this book. It was a joy to be a part of.
It was a joy to have you as well. Michelle, what about you?
I think for me, it was seeing how trauma-informed content design isn't just for people who work in trauma fields. I mean, obviously coming from a hospice background, it was crucial to what we were doing, but being able to see the principles that folks were unpacking in their chapters. And I'm going to shout out to Josh again. He was so helpful for me in working through a lot of accessibility issues at my own company, and to see how it's so applicable no matter what field we come from. So whether I'm in banking or whether I'm doing a tutoring app or whether I'm in hospice, that creating trauma-informed content benefits all the users. And I don't know what a user is coming to my content with. Like, I don't know what their day has been like. I don't know what's in their past. I don't know that about them. And so being conscious of that across the board was so helpful for me. And I learned so much from all these authors. These people are amazing. And I'm so glad to count you guys as my colleagues now. So
Can I go to Con and tight 30 seconds for everyone left. So Con, what about you?
I think I'm gonna mirror what Josh said a lot, like everybody working together and the way that we all worked independently without someone having to manage us on how to do the thing, but also collectively, like giving feedback and like peer working the whole thing. that was amazing. And like even the process of writing the book felt trauma informed to me. In terms of like something in the book, I think that also as an engineer and developer, like what really struck me was just a chapter about accessibility and WCAG, because I did lead quite a lot of WCAG until before, and getting this different perspective and how we can work in a different way has helped me a lot.
Thank you, Jane.
I agree with so much that's been said already by Josh and everyone, but I think on a personal note, falling back in love with pair writing, because I had some horrendous experiences, and then being able to write alongside people that I admire, and the work that you have done is quite frankly staggering, and to be able to be part of that has been fantastic, and to be able to pair write again and get over my own my own fears was fantastic. So yeah, it was just a brilliant experience.
And Steph.
Everything everybody said already. I think it was a huge learning experience. Trauma-informed content design in itself is a learning curve, but then to kind of bring all of you together and then learn from all of your experience as well, it's just such an evolving thing that we will never know it all. So it's lovely to know you all, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
I will wrap up by saying what amazed me about working in this area is just how willing everyone was to share their experience and their learning. Everybody said yes, and everybody wanted to, and there's such a passion and a drive to do this kind of work, and it feels like it's the right thing to do, and it was just nice to connect with all of that. And we have gone 34 seconds over time. I'm sorry, Millie, I'll hand it over to you to wrap up.
Oh, that's absolutely fine. Thank you so much. Well, thank you to all our speakers, Josh, Steph, Jane, Con, Michelle, and of course, Rachel. Thank you for hosting as well. It's been super interesting. I've learned loads, loads of really great comments in the chat too. I mean, Rachel said at the start, this wasn't about plugging the book, so I'm going to plug the book for you. It's excellent. Go and buy it. If you work for a company that cares about content design, get them to buy it too. Yes, and let's all take on these principles in all of our work, because it's super important for everybody.